Announcements before we get started with the introduction. I know we're running late, but we'll make the announcements nevertheless. Tomorrow at 4 p.m., Negro Slave Revolts, both of these by tonight's speaker, Dr. Apteker. We have several Angela Davis books over there, as well as more books by Dr. Apteker. Other announcements. There's a Committee on Equality meeting 1 week from tonight, Thursday the 18th, and it's in the boardroom of this building at 7 p.m. Everyone's invited. We also have a rally for human rights, which is taking place tomorrow at 2 p.m. south of Parks Library, dealing with Peace Rally to support Palestinian human rights. That will be tomorrow at 2 p.m. by the library. Once again, everyone is invited to that. I wanted to take this time to thank two people, though. Gary Tartikoff, who is the faculty chair of the committee, and Pat Miller in the back, who does a lot of the organizing and bringing the speakers here, and without whom this wonderful lectures program we have would be quite impossible. But now on to the main event. I guess you've waited long enough. Tonight we're very lucky to have with us Dr. Herbert Apteker. Dr. Apteker received his PhD from Columbia University in 1943. He received an honorary PhD from Martin Luther University in the GDR, I believe, in 1966. He was a Paul Robeson Scholar at Rutgers University in 1981, Du Bois Lecturer, UMass Amherst. He's been a visiting lecturer at Yale University in the History Department of Bryn Mawr, Director, American Institute for Marxist Studies, a Guggenheim Fellow. He was an editor for Masses and Mainstream. He has a distinguished academic and scholarly career. He has written extensively on African American history, democracy, on freedom, on revolution. Some of his better-known works include one of the books which I held up here, which was his PhD dissertation called The American Negro Slave Revolts. Another is his 4-volume set, A Documentary History of the Negro People in the United States. He has finished editing 38 volumes of collected 38 volumes of Du Bois, as well as 3 volumes of correspondence. And he has many other books, up to 80. But he's not only a writer, he's not only an academic. In the 30s, he was an organizer of tobacco workers, and he organized against peonage in Georgia. He's been a member of the Communist Party since 1939. He was the first American to go to Vietnam, taking Tom Hayden and Storton Lind with him. He broke the ban on radical speakers at many universities, including Berkeley, where he now teaches in the law school. But more important than all his qualifications, at least to me, is not so much how many awards you get and not how many books you write, but what is in those books and what those books mean. And I wanted to share with you very briefly what his writing has meant to me. Because as I look around and I was taught American history, and I'd look at American history, and I'd look at our past and our roots, the more and more I looked, and the way I was taught, I saw a history I was greatly ashamed of. I saw a history of a country of slave owners. I saw a history of a country that was founded in the genocide of another people. I saw a history littered with people like Rockefellers, with Morgans, with people such as this, and it made it very hard for me as an American to reconcile myself with my history until my eyes were opened to writers such as Dr. Apteker, in which instead of slave owners, I saw revolting slaves. I saw the Grimke sisters fighting slavery. I saw Harriet Tubman. I saw many people who have made this land what it is, people who have been washed over by the history writers that most of us read in high school and college. He brought to life many people who have struggled to make this country what it is today in terms of the freedoms and the liberties we do have. And I think we could do with a great many more writers like Dr. Apteker. So thank you for enduring that rather long and wieldy introduction, but please join me now in welcoming Dr. Herbert Apteker.
Well, you had a lot of trouble setting this up. I hope it was worthwhile. We'll see. And I thank the people responsible for bringing me here and for fixing this microphone. Is this all right? Can I be heard? Will somebody in the last row say yes or no? It's all right? Good. I prepared something on affirmative action. The main arguments opposing affirmative action are in a book by Professor Nathan Glaser of Harvard. The book is called Affirmative Discrimination. It was published about 15 years ago. And it is the basic presentation of opposition, and nothing has been added. It's used all the time. It was actually quoted in some of the decisions of the Supreme Court in 1989, 1990, the Reagan-Bush Supreme Court, when they did so much to undercut affirmative action. I published a critique of Professor Glaser's book in Political Affairs in April 1977. I mention this because people may want to read both works. There's a longer essay by me on affirmative action in a book called Racism, Imperialism, and Peace by me, which was published by Minnesota 3 years ago. So much for some bibliographical background. I thought it would be useful, before enumerating each of the arguments against affirmative action and replying to them, to define racism. What is it? Racism is a system of thought and practice. Please observe, a system of thought and practice. It is never one without the other. That's the first thing. Which conceives, and in accordance therewith acts, as though a certain people are significantly, indelibly inferior to other people, particularly the people doing the measuring. Inferior substantively, significantly, indelibly, permanently, especially in mental capacity, but also in emotional capabilities. And as part of that concept, a people so afflicted who therefore are and should be subordinate to others more gifted. The condition of subordination is held to be natural and necessary in the racist ideology. Racism is not the same as the ethnocentrist idea. It is also not nationalism. It is also not elitism, which perhaps is the oldest in class society. That is the concept that the poor are poor because they are no good. The two meanings of poor. One is poor without wealth, and one is poor without merit. In fact, I once thought of doing a class-conscious dictionary which would show this partisanship in language. Rich cream, rich joke, villain, and the medieval villain. Wretch in Shakespeare, which means someone who is poor, and we know what it means now, and so on and so forth. We can do a large dictionary. So this elitism is deep, at least in this country. It is related to racism, but it is not racism. Perhaps the closest, although not identical, and I make these points for enlightenment, is male chauvinism, which is also as old as recorded history. Racism, by the way, is new, is an important point. Racism does not appear in the ancient world. It does not appear in the medieval world. Racism appears, certainly in its modern guise, with the appearance of capitalism. Racism is part of the shift from feudalism to capitalism, and particularly in its most awful form, the conquest and ravishment of Africa. The first slave trading expedition is 1454, Portuguese. Of record, they probably began earlier. And you then begin to get the concept of racism in the literature. You don't before, on the contrary. So that poison is relatively recent. The form we know in terms of anti-African and African-derived peoples is associated with the conquest of Africa and the African slave trade. But this male chauvinism has much of the content, and all of this plays a part in making possible racism. That is, the female is mentally inferior, even biologically, with a smaller brain, for example. And also emotionally inferior, subject to hysteria and so on and so forth. You can read in the literature descriptions of women. Take out the word woman and put in the word African, you don't have to change anything else. Nevertheless, they're not identical. Racism is sui generis and is what I said it to be. It is normally associated with differentiation in color, always with some fairly physical differentiation. But it doesn't have to be color. Witness the English traditional attitude towards the Irish, which certainly from Cromwell on cannot be called anything but racism. By the way, there's a very close relationship in the history between the African American and the Irish. And this is waiting for a book. There isn't even an article. The traditional attitude has the Irish as very anti-black. Well, like practically everything that's traditional, that is only about 1/4 true. And there is a very significant affinity and a conscious affinity. For instance, the Garvey movement was very close to the Irish liberation movement in its early days. That's a footnote. So that's what racism is. Benjamin Rush the revolutionary patriot who signed the Declaration of Independence and was an MD and was the Surgeon General of Washington's Army and was one of the founders of psychiatry. Benjamin Rush held that what he called Negromania was clinical. He thought it was an insanity. He dates in the 1770s, 1780s. And having done some work down there in the 30s, I would say that that's relevant. There is a disease, a mental disease of racism, and particularly this kind of phobia. What are the arguments against affirmative action? There are not many. You watch me. If I leave them out, you bring it up. I'll appreciate it. One is, and this fills Glazer's book and other articles, one is that racism in the United States is something which is over. It's a matter of the past. And it is therefore absurd to spend much time fighting it, passing legislation about it, setting up institutions to undo it when it has been undone. True, and regrettably, it existed, but happily, it no longer really exists. It's kind of a demagogic device now, and that's it. That's one of the main arguments. To argue against this, especially now in the United States, is almost insulting, and I do not mean to insult you, but it is necessary to examine the argumentation. And so, this idea that racism is something that is past, as I say, is absurd and insulting, but widespread. One may offer in 2 or 3 minutes a few facts. For instance, the median income of African American families is approximately half that of white. African American children are 3 times as likely as whites to be living in a family below the poverty line. Unemployment for African American adult males is at least twice that of whites. Among teenagers, it is at least 3 times greater. 27% of young African American men, 20 to 24, are actually outside of the economy. That is, they're not in school, they're not working, and they've given up looking for work. They're outside the economy in that sense, compared to about 10% of the white population of that age. The African American population equals about 12 or 13% of the total population. It's always undercounted, but it's about 13%. But 50% of those in prison are African American. And so forth. This argument against affirmative action, therefore, that racism is something of the past, and we are flaying a dead horse, that anyone can argue this way, manifests profound racism. That one can do this and write a book about it and get tenure at Harvard University is not too surprising. Second, it is held that affirmative action is faulty because it penalizes merit. Actually, of course, racism is an instrument penalizing merit. That's one of its main characteristics. That's what racism is. Racism is the systematic penalizing of merit. Of course, this society operates in considerable part on one's class and wealth. One's sex, his influence, and on corruption, who knows who, and so on. Everyone who isn't a child knows this, unless he's the President of the United States. There's no black second baseman in the big leagues until 1947. What does that mean? That means until 1947, those who played second base did not play on the basis of merit. They played well, but they did not face the competition of the African American ball player. Before the 1950s, there was no black person singing at the Metropolitan Opera until Marian Anderson and Leontyne Price. What does that mean? That means those who did sing there, and Paul Robeson never did, were there, in part at least, because they did not face the competition of a voice heard once in 1,000 years, as Toscanini said of Marian Anderson. And all of us and our parents and our grandparents were deprived of this. And see how many hearts were broken. How many hearts were broken before Marian Anderson could sing her heart out for us. This idea of penalizing merit is disgusting by those who argue with it against affirmative action. It is obscene. The best that one can say about it is that it is ignorant. The argument of merit is meretricious, and those who use it probably know that. They are demagogic rotters without a heart. Third, of some consequence in terms of law, it is held that affirmative action deals with groups, and that law, especially Anglo-American law, deals with individuals, with the defendant who appears before a court, a person, human being. And in this sense, the affirmative action legislation, etc., is wrong. It's a paradoxical approach in our concept of law. It doesn't deal with the person. Those who argue this show that they have no understanding of the history of racism. It's also a somewhat ironic argument, as is the merit argument. Because, of course, a fundamental characteristic of racism is that it denies individuality. They all look alike. They all look alike because you don't look at them. And you don't look at them because of what they are. They don't count. And in law, of course, it wasn't an individual who was enslaved. It was a people who was enslaved. Slavery is not individual matter. Of course, a person was enslaved. But that person was enslaved in our law because that person was black. And the assumption was in the law that an African and African-derived person was a slave. And if he or she wasn't, he or she had to have a document, a legal document, which says this person, despite the fact that he is of African descent, is not a slave. Otherwise, the law is very clear. African and African-derived peoples are slaves. That's the law. So there's something special about that. And therefore, the approach to it, the elimination of it, must reflect some knowledge of this reality. Racism is not individuals. It's not a person. It is a group so defined. And this is especially true of black people in the United States, and that's the nature of slavery. That's the nature of its law. Therefore, this argument from a legalistic point of view, which is very common, especially before courts, is absurd, is ignorant, is wrong. The fourth point, which is related to law, is that the enforcement of affirmative action frequently operates with the motivation of those facing the law not relevant to the consequences of the law. That is, motivation of the one accused is frequently in law part of the crime. To prove first-degree murder, one must prove premeditation. The same is true in many other phases of law. That's true. How here will you prove motivation? And this is one of the ways the courts, as they become subject to racism more and more, uses to destroy affirmative action, especially the Supreme Court now, requiring proof of motivation in a specific case. That, for example, no white person in the history of the United States, going back to the colonial past, has ever been executed for the murder of a colored person, not just a black person, but a colored person. Never has any white person ever suffered the death penalty for the murder of a person of color. It's almost unbelievable. I assure you it's true. Can that be explained otherwise than racism? Can you individually pin motivation? In execution, black people are executed 8 times more often than white defendants. 8 times. When this kind of evidence is presented to a court with a black person subject to execution, and that person has come out and suffered from and been judged by a racist society as demonstrated by this fact of 800% greater execution rate of his brothers and sisters, The court, the present Supreme Court, says such statistics are irrelevant. You have to prove the motivation in the case of that defendant. My son-in-law was a member of the Communist Party and was a teacher at San Jose State College, University. Could never get promoted. He was a fine teacher and had all the necessary degrees and so on in engineering. Finally, we went to court after years and years of no promotion and no tenure, and it was notorious as to why Jack so suffered. Now, in court in this case, we finally won. Why? Because the chancellor of that particular branch of the California educational system had been appointed by the moron Governor Reagan. And since he was appointed by a moron, he was himself an idiot. And since he was an idiot, he put in writing his instructions to Jack's department that that man is not to be promoted and not to receive tenure because he's a radical. Therefore, we won in court. And you could win in court. But this moron put that in writing. But after a while, you run out of morons. We have one now who's vice president and so on, but still it's a limited quantity. So this requirement of motivation is as absurd and as true as the story I just told you. This again relates to the social phenomenon of racism. That it is not an individual thing in which you look for motivation. It is a social phenomenon, so that you have a community with 60% black people and no black person on a jury. That's not a coincidence, unless you're crazy. It's clearly not a coincidence. But prove motivation. In the court of law, prove motivation for that defendant. Cannot be done. Why can't it be done? Because that's not the character of racism. Because racism is social. It's a social phenomenon. Therefore, it manifests itself socially. And if you're not blind or purposely blind, you understand it. Then we hear, and hear especially now from Mr. Bush, affirmative action is a quota system. There seems to be something awful about quotas. I'm Jewish. When I finally got into Columbia in the 30s, and finally got a PhD, there was a quota against me. All my buddies who happened to have been Jewish and wanted to study medicine couldn't study in the United States. There was a quota. They went to Scotland, or to Lebanon, or to Syria, where they permitted a Jew to learn how to become a doctor. That's in my lifetime, quota. And when I went to Columbia, it took an enormous battle to get one black person admitted to graduate school. much older than I, beautiful person, and of course, a noteworthy scholar, Lorenzo J. Green, whose work on the colonial period is now classical. But he never got a job except in Black University, ended up as head of the department, Lincoln University in Missouri, and is now gone. But he was my only colleague, the only black colleague, and that took a battle. That's in the 30s, here in New York. I'm not talking about Mississippi. That's one kind of quota. That is, there is a racist quota, which is the classical use of that term. And Albert Shanker, the head of the teachers union, with an enormous Jewish constituency, knows that. And in his opposition to affirmative action, uses it, because many of the Jewish teachers have a history of quota and what it meant, or for their parents in Europe. That racist quota, such as in Tsarist Russia and here, was to keep people out. That was the purpose of the quota. 2%, 1%, 1/10 of 1% would be allowed in, usually accompanied by graft. But the purpose of the quota, the meaning of quota historically, is to limit, to bar entry. Now everyone knows that the quota in affirmative action is the opposite. It's precisely the opposite. It is not a method to keep out. It is an effort to let in. That's the point. It is not malevolent. It is benevolent, certainly in intention. So the very concept of quota here is the opposite of that term that people like Shanker and the President of the United States knowingly use demagogically. One of the clever lines in Professor Glaser's book is that affirmative action is reverse discrimination. That's from his book. It's now in everybody's tongue. It's not reverse discrimination. Affirmative action is an effort, one effort, not at reverse discrimination, but at reversing discrimination. That's what it is. Manifestly, obviously. That's about the argumentation. You know others will tell me. That's the case. By the way, there's something else in this whole concept. One of the real objections to affirmative action is that it challenges an economy of scarcity, which of course is the nature of our economy. For instance, in terms of getting into med school, if you have a benevolent quota, an affirmative action one, well, you'll try to reach some just proportion. And now about 2% of the physicians in the United States are African American. There's a quota for you. I don't hear any objection from President Bush that there is 2% of physicians and 50% are prisoners. That's a strange statistic, isn't it? That's a quota in fact, a social quota. which affirmative action seeks to reverse. But there's something else. Who says there has to be so few medical schools? Why is that? Why do we have community after community advertising for physicians? Don't have anybody to take care of anybody. Who says we have to have whatever the hell the number is, 200 or whatever it is, I don't know what it is, 200 medical schools with 250 million people? Why? Why can't we have 500? 2,000? Whatever we need. Because the AMA doesn't want us to have it. Because they want the average salary of a member physician to be $160,000 a year. It can't be $120,000. Who says so? This is one of the most profound objections to affirmative action. It postulates opposition to an economy of scarcity. We take a minute or two to place affirmative action historically in terms of the history of the African American people in particular. There are three phases in African American history. Phase one is the effort to achieve personhood, to get out of the status of property like a dog. I'm talking about law and reality. Like an auction block, to sell children, to display women, to buy flesh. Get out of that stage into the stage of being human. That's phase one. It took about 200 years. And 500,000 men killed each other. And it almost destroyed the country. And that phase one was from being a piece of property to being a human being. The second phase in Afro-American history is the effort to move from being a person to being a citizen. Only the black person is born in the United States and not a citizen, except the Indian, not taxed, as it says in the Constitution. Indian not taxed. That meant one we haven't conquered yet. That's what that meant. An Indian not taxed. We haven't either conquered them or killed them yet. That's the meaning of the phrase, actually. And it occurs in many of our official documents. The Indian not taxed. Oh my God, I don't know whether to laugh or cry. So, except for that, any person born in the United States and so on, the Constitution, is a citizen thereof, except if he's black. He's not a citizen. Well, of course, that was the second big problem. Now they're not slaves, and they're human beings, and what the hell are they? Are they citizens? If they're not citizens, what are they? Is there some other thing in law? No, there's no other thing. You're a slave, you're a person. If you're a person, you're a citizen. Or are you? Well, with the black people, with the African American people, it took about 100 years until the 1960s before that was accomplished. In paper, in law, The African American is a citizen with no differentiation in law on that question. That took 100 years.